All right, then, quite a bit to get through in the world of aviation, and especially what governments and businesses are doing in that space. My guest from Addis Ababa, Azamedine Ngatu from Fairfax Africa Fund, and of course, Kwame Wino, the CEO of Institute of Economic Affairs, is still with me in studio. Kwame, Kenyan legislators decided to renationalize KQ this year, but simply put, can we afford it?
I don't think we can unless they do some, or rather they cannot, we cannot afford Kenya Airways in the same fashion in which it had been run for two reasons. One, it wasn't making enough money to pay for itself, but also because Kenya's finances at this moment are just probably the worst. So that convergence of factors just tells you that even with the renationalization, I think there's still going to be quite a lot of cutting that's going to have to be done if this airline is going to work, because it doesn't look like they're going to find a strategic partner who's prepared to pump money in.
So essentially the status quo might remain for now.
Yes, of course, the status quo might remain, but obviously it'll just sink deeper and deeper. I don't think that they have enough cash to keep it running for all the routes, and at the same time keep some of the expenses and investments that are required to as part of the original plan.
Right. Zamedene, Ethiopian Airlines, it's the only profitable carrier that we have, the only profitable large carrier we have here in Africa. It's had sterling year after sterling year as far as business is concerned. Might part of it be up for sale at some point?
Well, the government, as you know, Rama, has announced a wide-ranging privatization program. The ones that are initially slated will be the telecoms, the sugar, and others. At the back end of it, there is some indication that Ethiopian Airlines might also have some form of privatization. In fact, in my view, and this is just my view, the form of privatization for Ethiopian Airlines is not going to be the standard one that you expect where the government offloads the airline. We have already seen what it would look like. The cargo business has already been partially privatized. It's now a joint venture with DHL. So my team and I, we've done about 14 African transaction advisory over the last 15 years. So we have a fairly good idea of what would work in the airline business. I think what I expect will be some of the standalone business units. For example, the Aviation Academy could be a JV with another big global company that runs that very well. MRO is a classic example where we can have a joint venture with a global MRO operator. Catering, but not the core long haul, extremely successful, extremely profitable airline business. I'm not so sure. It's already, in fact, Ethiopian Airlines is actually an acquirer. As you know, it owns virtually all airlines that have been started in the last few years or are about to be started in Africa. So it's an acquisition mode. So I'm not expecting the core passenger airline business to be privatized, but the others are natural JV partnership models, and that, I think, the cargo should give an indication as to if any of the other business will privatize. That will probably be the model, because in fact, just this week Ethiopian Airlines started flying to Houston. I saw some numbers, which is very impressive. As an African, we should make us all feel good. By flying to Houston, Ethiopian Airlines will be pumping in something like over $100 million annually to the Houston economy. An African country contributing $100 million to the American economy just because it's flying there, because it's bringing in tourists and passengers from business. So I don't see that model where you see in other countries privatization of companies being offloading the government stake. I don't see that for the core business, but for the other parts is only natural, and the cargo is probably the way the others will be JV'd as well.
Okay, speaking of JVs though, I think one of the last deals that we've seen in this month, at least within East Africa, is Rwanda. They sold 60% of the new airport that they're building in Bugesera to Qatar Airways. That's valued at about $1.3 billion or so. From Ethiopian Airlines perspective, as someone who's invested in the airline space, how big a potential competitor is Rwanda?
So I get asked this question all the time. Let me put something in perspective. 80% of into and out of Africa air travel is done by non-African carriers. 80%. So we only today, African carriers have only 20%. So there isn't really a concern that Rwanda Air will take business from Ethiopian, or Ethiopian will take business from A-Sky or whatever. I don't think that should be our focus. Our focus as Africans should be, how do we reduce that 80%? And it's actually the other way around, that African carriers move 80% of the passengers, and non-African carriers move the other 20%. That should be our focus, not Rwanda Air or any other African carrier. In fact, the other thing I want to make sure is almost every airline, no African airline today, with the exception of Ethiopian Airlines, makes money. I mean, that's a big statement. Not a single African carrier makes money. That should tell you that there's something wrong with the aviation, with the airline business in Africa. So one of the solutions I've given, and others I'm sure will concur with me, is we need to create size. This is a very expensive business. So each African country going out on its own, creating standalones, wanting to fly long haul, in the long term is doomed for failure. Europe has only 3 carriers, 3 airline groups: Air France, KLM, Lufthansa, and IAG, which is the British Airways and Iberia. Okay? 3. And that's an economy that's infinitely bigger than Africa's GDP. And they just have 3 of them. In the United States, we have just essentially 5 carriers. It's big, a big consolidation took place in the last 5, 6, 7 years. There's just 5 carriers control 80% of the American airline business. So why is it that in Africa we think this model where everybody goes out and buys these shiny little aircrafts at very expensive prices, wanting to fly long haul, thinks it would work? It won't. So let's create partnerships amongst African carriers.
Right.
So for example, Ethiopian Airlines has started this model where it's partnering with everybody. I think that's the way we should go, not fear each other.
Right, and I totally agree with you on this. Kwame, let me come to you on this. The fact of the matter is that, as Zemadene is arguing, not everyone can afford an airline, right? And this is a huge business. It essentially relies on razor-thin margins, big matters. Aren't African governments missing that point, and they're just focusing on trying to create these little airlines instead of just having a proper open skies market?
Precisely. I mean, I think that, for instance, in East Africa, to have 5, 6 airlines all competing in addition to the external ones simply tells you that a
because
lot
now
of
Tanzania has a carrier,
yes,
Kenya has a carrier, Rwanda has a carrier,
Uganda
is of course setting up one.
Yes, and of course we have the Ethiopian one, which is largely East African. So you have 5 of those. If you talk about those alone, I think it's clear that all of them are going to struggle if they have to keep competing. So all the governments that take a nationalist view about establishing airlines are definitely making a mistake, partly because, not just because of East Africa where the market is small in relative terms, but even globally, running an airline profitably is a very, very difficult thing. Few airlines actually keep that record of positive returns for up to a decade. So they can't do that in the US, not all of them are capable of doing that in Europe. They just select airlines globally. I think less than 10 that actually have made money over the last 5 years consistently. So obviously, here we are. I mean, what would make sense, obviously, is the joint ventures, but more importantly, perhaps for all of East Africa to converge into a single one. 2 would probably be possible, but the 5 that we have, and with ambitions for many more, I think it's going to be a lot of money thrown down the drain.
All right, Zemadene, one last question for you. Ethiopia doesn't have an equities market, an active equities market at the moment, but let's just take that argument a little further. Assuming that the Ethiopian government would decide to offload a minority stake in any of the businesses that you mentioned, maybe the cargo side or something else, some other part of the enterprise, would it be open to selling those shares at the Nairobi bourse?
I think this is only natural that we have, first of all, just for your viewers to understand, at the moment there's no stock market or equity market in Ethiopia. But in late 2020, probably early 2021, there will be a stock market in Ethiopia. Probably it's called the Addis Ababa Stock Exchange. So one of the suggestions some of us have, and I'm sure the government has thought about, is offloading, doing IPOs of some of the state-owned enterprises, partial IPOs on the Addis Ababa Stock Exchange. But ultimately, as you know, Rama, standalone stock exchanges, again, using the airline model argument I made, probably are not viable in Africa either. So probably cross-listings with Nairobi, cross-listings with JSC. I think that would be one of the ways to create bulk. Africa's entire GDP, as optimistic as I am, is equal to Brazil's GDP, all 54 countries. So it's relatively small. So when you fragment it, it doesn't appeal very much to international investors, even for domestic investors. So the cross-listing will be one of the approaches, but first you have to offload it on the newly soon to be established stock exchange, because there's a lot of companies, even part of Ethiopian Airlines, some of the other businesses I mentioned could all be offloaded including the cargo business and the catering business and the MRO. The telco, which is going to be partially privatized this coming March, will also be. And a lot of the MNCs, especially the FMCG MNCs, now it's coming into Ethiopia, like they're doing in Kenya, can now offload, do IPOs of their local Ethiopian operations on the new soon to be established, and then have cross-listing with Nairobi, have cross-listing with Dar and other places, all the way up to Nigeria. So the approach in Africa, we started this program talking about CFTA, right?
Yeah.
So what we need to think about is creating bulk across all industries in Africa if we're going to be competitive globally.
All right, I don't think I can find a better way of ending that. Gentlemen, just hold on for one moment, because our viewers, of course, have been looking at this topic, debating about it intensely online for most of the year. So we did ask you what you think of plans to re-establish national carriers or expand or downsize, depending on the country you're on. Jerry Owili from our social media team has been looking at your views. So what are the people saying?
Well, thanks, Roma. And indeed, Africa's aviation industry has elicited quite some mixed reactions on social media. Now, despite that devastating crash in March, Ethiopian Airlines is still a favorite among air travelers in the continent. Suresh Neleyapan says the Ethiopian carrier is disciplined and has a dedicated team from top to bottom with no interference from politicians. He goes on to say that it has the right pricing and relatively good service. Suresh goes on to say that the airline will soon rule Africa and even part of the Asian skies. Sosa Nemera, on the other hand, says that success comes from the blessings of God. The success story of the Ethiopian Airlines was prophesied a decade ago. And she continues on to say that the carrier will be a giant company in the world in the days to come. But some viewers were skeptical of Africa's aviation industry, particularly in Ghana, Kenya and South Africa. Richard Apollos from Ghana believes that the country cannot afford to purchase 3 Boeing Dreamliners. He says even if Ghana Airways is revived, it will still crumble again so long as corruption persists in the country. Musa Kigundu, on the other hand, feels that some airlines seem to be headed in the right direction, especially with better management. Now, he says RwandAir is one of the examples of these airlines that might move in the forward direction. Daniel Weru, on the other hand, says aviation in Africa is generally poor. According to him, Ethiopian Airlines is not only the best in Africa, but also the best in the world. He goes on to say, I think Kenya Airways and other airlines should do a benchmarking from Ethiopian Airlines. And finally, Eugene from South Africa says, South African Airways has simply been plagued by corruption. We're just hoping that maybe 2020 can bring better tidings, especially for these airlines that are struggling, probably Kenya Airways, South African Airways, and the others. We hope for a better year for them next year.
Indeed. Kwame, quick reactions? What do you make?
Well, I think, yes, we have them. I think there's the optimism that everybody expects, but my view about it is that the airlines that we have, they're buying these very big planes that require huge servicing costs and at the same time require very specialized pilots, very specialized facilities. Not all of them have them. So, for instance, the 787 that Tanzania has flies twice a week to Mumbai. That can't even pay for its own operation costs. So unless something happens in terms of the massive expansion, the number of people who travel, the price sensitivity at the same time as the global market gets better, then obviously that is, but it's not a good sign for many of them.
All right, Zamadena in Addis, any last thoughts on Africa's aviation market and where we're headed in 2020?
Right. A very simple message. The airline is a business. It needs to be run like a business. It cannot be patronage jobs. Corporate governance has been the Achilles heel for the failures of a lot of the African airlines. So run them like a business, like Ethiopian Airlines is. Ownership doesn't matter. Who owns it, whether it's private or government, is really irrelevant. Otherwise, both Ethiopian Airlines and Emirates would not have been successful. They're both owned by government, but they're exceptionally successful. I just want to point one final point, though. Just to encourage Africans that it is doable when you run it well. Ethiopian Airlines today is the 5th biggest airline in the world by number of countries it serves. Get that, the 5th biggest. An African-owned, African-operated airline is now amongst the 5 largest airlines in the world by the number of destinations, the countries it serves. It is doable and is making more money than all African airlines combined. So as Africans, we have an example. We should replicate that. But the key message is we got to come together, work together, create bulk, or else I think the social media sentiment, I completely agree with you. If we get the governance right, then I think, and then the politicians step back and let the professionals run these things, I think we'll have very successful airlines in Africa. 3 or 4 big ones, and then the rest could be sort of feeders or partners to the bigger carriers. That should be the vision we have for Africa's aviation.
All right, we'll leave it there for the time being. Zemedine Nigatu live in the Ethiopian capital of Addis Ababa, and of course here with me in studio, Kwame Wino, CEO of the Institute of Economic Affairs. Gentlemen, thank you.